Well, my overall impression is, it's exactly what I was expecting. It's a car that's been designed as a whole, with some objectives and with some engineering rigor put into the design process and the planning process. So it's kind of what I expected. I think the thing that I just want to clarify before we kind of go too much further is they haven't released the regs. Everyone's saying the new regulations have been announced. No, they haven't. The FIA have shown us a concept car of what the regulations will be like. The regulations will come out later this month, and there's still more debate and discussion to go into the technical regulations and the sporting regulations, which will underline how some of these new technical features on the car will work. So this really is just a sort of a taster of what's going to be coming up rather than the actual detail. In fact, of the rendered model that we've seen in some of the CAD models, you see there are actually technical differences between them. So, it's not entirely clear exactly what's happening, but overall, I'm, really comforted by the fact that we've got, a really joined up idea here. However, a lot of the reporting around this has been very negative and slightly misinformed, suggesting that we have the engine regs and then they had to change the chassis regs to meet this, somehow compromised engine. And while yes, the engine's compromised, it's not. The whole thing has been designed in one go. It's just that they had to release the engine reg so much earlier because obviously it takes a much longer time to develop a power unit than it does for the chassis. So yeah, I mean, I think we're on the right path here, and that's good.
Question I'm dying to ask, and I'll ask you, if not, anybody else that we can talk to, engineers, but how are they going to save all that weight with the additional batteries they're going to need on that car for 50% electrification? Where is the weight saving come from? I understand that the car's smaller dimensionally, but that can't be the major factor in the amount of weight they're trying to save, surely.
No, I mean, I think this is one of the big questions, and I know some of the teams have made some noises about this already. Yeah, the car is slightly smaller, but when we look back at when the 2022 regulations came in, Sauber, Alfa Romeo made a car that was 10 centimeters shorter and saved about 10 kilograms. So you are going to save some by just having simply a smaller car. Now, we don't know what safety changes have been brought in with the new rules yet, because that tends to add weight as well. And the new power unit is going to be significantly heavier. So yeah, there is a challenge. And again, I think we're going to see a lot of black cars in 2026 with just some flashes of color as teams do everything they can to save weight. That's going to be one of the biggest design challenges, other than getting to understand the new aerodynamics.
It's, as you say, correctly say, obviously, that every time there's a safety improvement, it tends to put on weight. So it would seem, I don't know whether you would agree with this, that it's quite ambitious at this stage to come up with a number that will be the minimum weight for that car so far ahead of 26. Given, I mean, how many unknowns are there in terms of battery technology and what the batteries are actually going to weigh by 2026? How fast is the Formula One technology world going to move now in order to make batteries last longer and be lighter and be more recyclable if possible?
Well, in terms of the weight of the battery, that is set as a minimum. So I can't remember the exact figure. I think it was something like 30 kilograms, up from around 20. Off the top of my head, I stand to be corrected on that. The battery will be bigger, but the technology that's already inside these batteries, as much as it goes, hugely unspoken about by the teams and the manufacturers, which I think is a travesty, because it's, they are absolutely incredible. Anyone that's into RC cars and knows that the batteries that go into them are incredibly powerful, very high C rates. Formula One battery surpasses all of that technology by like tenfold. So I don't think I think of all of this, the power unit development will probably be the thing that is the least in terms of question that we're going to get there. Now you see lots of people reporting in the media that all the different manufacturers, and someone's ahead and someone's behind, and stating horsepower differences between these different power units, which has to be complete rubbish. Unless you've gone in and spied in all of the different manufacturers, how would you ever know? But I think certainly, the big three of Ferrari, Mercedes, and I
Red
suppose we
Bull.
could say either Honda or Red Bull, which have parted ways. We'll have Audi coming into the mix as well. But I think there's sort of those big three. I think they will probably be on a par with each other. I think Audi, Alpine would be the bigger question mark, and I just don't think the power unit is going to be the big issue here. They've got the battery to contend with, got the different fuel to contend with, and different ways of operating the engine. But I don't think that's going to be a problem. The weight of the engine has gone up. And for me, this is, again, one of the things where I think we've kind of gone wrong. Everyone's going to blame the new 50-50 electric to combustion ratio, which is obviously up massively from like 80-20 that it is now. On the increase in weight, but they've now given the current engines are about 150 kilograms, the whole power unit, everything included. That's going to go up to 180, which is a big jump. 30 kilograms is a big lump, while we're still maintaining the 1,000 horsepower, which is still incredible. But when you actually break that down, the combustion engine with its turbo will weigh 130 kilograms. Now, that's a massive amount for a tiny, 48 centimeters long, 1.6 litre V6 weighing 130 kilograms is ridiculous. It's almost into production car weights. And I think this is where we're starting to go wrong. And everyone is saying, well, but the old V10s used to weigh like 80 kilograms. That they were allowed to because they were able to really shrink down. Those first V10s that came out and the V12s that came out in the late 80s, early 90s, they weighed 130 kilograms. Some of the kind of the Hart and the Yamaha and the TWR engines that were heavy, not the big manufacturers. So suddenly having a tiny V6 combustion engine that weighs as much as a 80s V12 is absurd. So it's not, this weight increase isn't to do necessarily with the hybrid package, which actually still comes in now at sort of 50 kilograms for 500 horsepower. I think that's pretty good value in terms of power to weight to size. So yeah, I think let's not concern ourselves too much about the combustion engine. There's lots of talk about that the combustion engine won't have, the power unit won't have enough energy to last along the straights. And it's right. Yeah, we probably won't be able to recover enough energy because we don't have, front regenerative braking on these cars, which was one of the things that was missed in the regulations by that kind of committee of the manufacturers that said, some teams want it, some teams don't.
Can I stop you there? Can I stop you there, Scarbs? Why would anybody not want that?
The power unit regulations, as we know, had lots of different manufacturers involved, not just the incumbent manufacturers, but also Audi and Porsche and a few others. And the incumbents who are used to having, what we describe as the current package, thought that if Audi or Porsche came in with their recent WEC LMP1H experience, have front MGUKs, which were recovering energy and also deploying energy in a category, they would have an advantage. So they decided, okay, we won't have the front MGUK recovering energy, which is ridiculous because you think of how much those front brakes can do.
It's also nonsense under the heading of the FIA and Liberty constantly beating the drum and saying we want more manufacturers to come into the sport. And the minute they come in, they say, oh, well, you can't do this, you can't do that because you might have an advantage because you've been racing sports cars. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's a big opportunity that was missed, even if they didn't actually use the front MGU to deploy to create the four-wheel drive, which again, a lot of people have something about Formula One has to be rear-wheel drive, and I'm not that fussed. But
having just watched the Rally of Portugal, I'm totally into four-wheel drive. Thank you very much.
Exactly. But the flip side is obviously Audi and Porsche and other manufacturers came and says, well, hold on, we've got to develop an MGU-H, which is the hybrid system attached to the turbo, which is what Honda had so many problems with when they came in a year late to these regulations. So that's been dropped as well. So we've ended up with a kind of a camel of an engine where the committee have designed it and it's not really meeting anybody's needs in the perfect way. But that's what everyone's agreed. So that's what we're running with, and the chassis will complement that rather than having to adapt to make up for that.
Make a good point also about the V12 and V10s. Let me ask you this. What is the fuel tank comparison size between, say, that of a normally aspirated V12 back in the day and the fuel tank of the 26 car, which presumably is smaller, right, than the current car because it's only 50% power?
Yeah,
Yeah, so there's a
it's
big
yeah.
difference in the amount of fuel and the weight, therefore, in that area of the car.
Yeah, so I mean, often when I talk about car weights, I would typically describe it as the car's starting weight, which is the car with everything plus a tank of fuel and the driver on board. And that's a good way of comparing them. The current fuel tank is 110 kilograms. I think it's going to go down. This is, again, this isn't in the regulations yet, but it's probably going to be somewhere around the 80 kilogram mark, maybe plus 10 kilograms either way. So it's, a big reduction in weight again. Um, I was actually told a few weeks ago that when we had the V10s and refueling at Monza, they would actually get through 240 kilograms of fuel, but that's how much fuel those cars were using. So when everyone says, "Oh, let's go back to the old days," unless you have refueling, you're going to have a fuel tank 3 times the size of the current fuel tanks to accommodate every race without refueling. And I don't think many of us would ever want to see refueling come back. Certainly in an age where we're trying to push the sustainability message, seeing the car coming in and having to add fuel is, quite a negative message. So, these cars will be so efficient. And then I think this is the kind of the aim that FIA has gone for. And actually the whole package is make a more efficient car. And that really then starts to come back into the chassis regulations as well.
Scarbs, is there life beyond carbon fiber also in terms of strength or weight? And does the 26 car incorporate new materials in that respect, do you think?
There's nothing specific in the regulations. Carbon fiber for certain parts of the car is still absolutely the de facto material that you want to be using in terms of, its stiffness, for its weight. It's just way more efficient than anything else, and you can get the shapes, and it's relatively easy to manufacture. We're starting to see 3D printing of metals and other materials be used much more throughout the car, and replacing some of the trickier parts that were much more tricky to make in carbon fiber. Equally, they're starting to use different manufacturing techniques. So rather than hand lay up, they're actually able to, if I use the word 3D print, it's oversimplifying it, but you can actually have machines lay up carbon fiber parts now. Slightly different in some of their material qualities of standard woven carbon fiber, but all the same, it opens up other opportunities. So I don't think these regulations necessarily open the avenues, but most of those avenues are down to the teams opening them themselves. There's very few restrictions on finding some of these materials or the manufacturing techniques to use the materials.
I think 30% they're saying is the reduction in downforce, I guess, compared with this year's car, or the 20, or this era of car. What will the actual downforce be relative to prior to 22? And how similar will the car be in terms of where its center of pressure is? And I'm thinking now of ride heights, bouncing and so forth. What will the car be like aerodynamically, do you think? And how much downforce will there be? I mean, is it a massive reduction, or is it just taking us back a little bit from where we were?
I think this is one of the finer points that will be worked out in the final draft of the regulations, but the cars will have a lot less downforce. And that is
downforce from the chassis as distinct from the wings, or specific about
the
that?
wings, it's more from the underfloor. So the underfloor is going to be shorter because the car is shorter. The tunnels are much smaller in this car design. The floor starts a lot further back. You've got a lot of clever shaping around the front of the floor where you see these little barge board devices. So the underfloor is much less powerful. So the balance between floor downforce and wing downforce will be probably closer to what it was back previous to 2022, where you were kind of getting maybe half from the underfloor and half from the wings, sort of a 50-50 split between the front and the rear wings. And the front wing is much smaller because it's an in-wash design. That really isn't an issue. You don't have a problem creating downforce from a front wing. That's not the reason we get less downforce. So you're really getting much less from the underfloor. So in theory, the underfloor should be much less sensitive, which means that we shouldn't have some of the problems with bouncing and some of the balance issues that we've seen with the teams, particularly people like Mercedes, really struggling to get these cars to work super close to the floor. However, because the teams will always try and make the floor work as hard as they possibly can. The question is, how much harder are they going to really work with the suspension and super low ride heights to get the most out of this floor? And that kind of goes back to the pre-94 days where the cars were literally flat to the ground. And that always will create problems for the cars. So it depends how the teams go about developing performance from these cars. Now, the other thing is that we've got these new Z mode and X modes on the car, so that you'll have a kind of a whole car DRS where both the front wing, the rear wing will open on the straights to give you that boost of speed, that increase in aerodynamic efficiency along the straights. What that means is, if you know that you're going to open your wings on the straights, then you can run basically full downforce from those wings at every circuit, because as soon as you get in a straight enough line, that you can open the wings up. So you may actually find that the teams could switch a bit of focus now to actually maximizing wing performance as much as floor, because it's been a bit of a kind of a secondary consideration, because they've always been largely fixed in their geometry. So there is that change as well. And the other thing that's going to make a change to the car's cornering performance is tires. And this will happen in two ways. The tires are going to be slightly narrower, so you're going to have less tread width, less contact patch area with the tarmac. But the cars are also narrower, and that means that you get a little bit more weight transfer, which means that your inside wheels will always be doing slightly less work through corners. So you're losing a lot of tire performance through this as well. Of course, you can recover tire performance really easily by playing with the tire construction and the compounds and how much the FA want the tires to degrade. So you could actually end up with what you had back in the sort of the 90s, where you have a tire that really can be run flat out for a stint before you change it for the next one, which I hope we get to. We don't get too much degradation with these tires, and they're not too sensitive to sliding like we've had with some of the recent Pirellis. So there's lots of different factors that are going to go into the mix to see how these cars will work, but they will definitely generate lap time in a very different way to the current cars, because it's going to be much more straight line speed, a lot less cornering speed, at least initially.
The current car ethos, of course, was to make it easier to overtake the car in front. And now that has gone away, they're doing that with all these other ways, with the active aero, with the engine boost as well, which is kind of admitting defeat, really. But anyway, we'll put that to one side.
I don't agree with that, to be honest, Peter. I mean, I think one of the things that hasn't really been discussed with these new cars that so far that I've seen in the media and the the official releases is that the aerodynamic concept of the car itself, in terms of ignoring all the active and the clever stuff, is significantly different to 2022 regs, and it's significantly different to everything that went before. So we now have what you would describe as an in-wash aerodynamic car. So if we think back to sort of 2019, the peak of the previous regulations, everything on the car was trying to create outwash. You were trying to push all the dirty air off the wings, off the tires, and push it as far away from the car as you can, so that running down the middle of the car, you got super clean air. And that meant that the car worked really efficiently, but created a huge dirty wake for the car behind, made it hard for the car to follow. 2022 came, and what they tried to do is, still with a degree of outwash, but just try to keep that much more in a straight line. So it was almost like a parallel wash rather than in or out wash. And that worked really well. I mean, I think we can say that we have seen cars able to follow much closer, particularly in groups. And there are other issues that may prevent overtaking, such as DRS trains and and tire strategies. But certainly these cars produce much less wake, which made the following car easier to follow the previous car. This new reg, you can see in the front wing that the front wing is pushing all the airflow inside the front wheels, and then those barge board devices that I pointed out at the front of the side pods on the floor are equally grabbing that tire wake and pushing it in through and passing basically where you wanted clean air going. You're now going to have all the dirty air. So the concept for the current car is basically to eat its own turbulence, which means that when you come to the wake behind the car, the wake is much, much smaller. And because the car's always running in its own turbulence, it should be much less sensitive to following in another car's wake. So these cars should be, again, almost, some of the technology is going back to I'm trying to think of what year that would be, pre-2009. when the outwash sort of concept really came in with those changing regulations. So these cars are going back to the aerodynamic philosophy, and not quite the size and shape of those cars, but going back to kind of, the 2000s, which I think a lot of people have a soft spot for in terms of those cars as another sweet spot in, design and performance of these cars.
Okay, point taken. So what you're really saying is that this car is using some of the data and understanding of the current cars in order to improve the whole business of making it. Okay, point taken. How quick are these cars potentially on the straight? We take a straight like Baku, for example. Forget about what wing they were running on the rest of the lap, but on that long straight at Baku, completely flat, what sort of top speeds do you think these cars are going to be reaching?
I mean, they're going to be reaching the sort of the typical DRS speeds, because they probably will shed a little bit more drag. They'll probably carry a little bit less drag with them as well because of the in-wash philosophy. So I mean, I don't think it's going to be that significant, because DRS is like already super effective. To put it into context, if you ran a Monaco spec wing on a car and then you open DRS, suddenly you've got a car that has got a Monza spec wing on it. So that's the difference DRS already gives you. So these new regulations aren't going to open up a huge amount of benefit in that respect. They're still going to have 1,000 horsepower. So I think you're talking maybe 10 horsepower improvement. Sorry, 10 horsepower. Sorry.
Okay, but then let's
10 miles per hour improvement.
Okay, but let's quantify it another way then. I'm guessing, therefore, that the speed differential between the car in front, which isn't obviously getting any DRS benefit in the new regulations, and the car behind is going to be greater now, because not only has it got the aero benefit, but also the power benefit. So the speed differentials are going to go up, correct?
Exactly. So the overtaking potential of the car is improved, because you will have that massive DRS effect, but done with the X mode engaged, where the wings will open front and rear, and you have that increase in engine performance as well. So overtaking, and again, we don't know the sport and regulations that will underpin this in detail yet, but yes, there will be a much bigger DRS effect with the combined effect of
Yeah.
mode.
What about brakes? Anything happening on brakes? I know you've been with the Brembo people this weekend as well. How do they think about 26 and what's going on there?
Well, as far as I can see at the moment, I don't believe there's any brake regulation changes. Again, we haven't seen the regulations, we've just seen the concept car. I don't think there's any significant. One of the things that they did really well with the change in regulations for 2022 was to make the brakes slightly larger, which gives you slightly better cooling, slightly better brake torque to decelerate. But also the brake calipers, which are such a team design thing, have now become open source, and everyone else can see what everyone else is doing with their brakes. So brake development has kind of plateaued a little bit, and I don't feel that we need in any big changes in the brakes, remembering that when you go from X mode with the wings flattened on the straights to having both your front and rear wings come up, you're going to have a huge increase in drag suddenly. So even without the torque of the brakes decelerating the car, just going back to Z mode with the wings engaged is really going to slow that car down enormously. Probably if there's a corner where you would maybe only just lift, you may actually just keep flat out, but just deploy the wings back to the normal position, and that will give you the deceleration that you need.
That nomenclature you're using sounds really cool, Scarbs. Let's just go through it. Z mode is back to square one, is that right?
So Z mode, and this is all to do with what they call Cartesian coordinates, which I never understood when they said that word. It's basically what you use in CAD. So in CAD, you have an X, Y, and a Z axis.
Yeah.
And if you remember, we used to talk about Y250 and the Y100 wing at the back of the car. Y is going, laterally away from the car. That's that plane. Z is height. So when you think about downforce, it's operating down through the car in that Z axis. So when you look at what your coefficient of downforce is, it's CZ. And so Z mode is when you've got your wings deployed, maximum downforce. And that's what you have for the corners. And then on the straights, you have X mode. Now, X is going along the car's center line. And again, so the car's length is in that direction. And your coefficient of drag, which works in that direction as well, is CX. So when you're in X mode, you'll have the wings flattened and you're going to have maximum speed on the straights. So this is what they've decided to use them rather than some other sort of nomenclature. And the power boost is going to be where you get that overtaking boost, which is kind of a push to pass technology that they'll deploy with these turbo engines.
And there's still going to be KERS, whatever, of some description,
So,
obviously. And they're still going to call it that?
As far as I know, it's still going to be called ERS-K. So the hybrid, there used to be, currently there's two hybrids. There's the one on the turbo, ERS-H, that's deleted now. And you have ERS-K, which is the MGU-K, which is attached directly to the crankshaft via gears. So that will become more powerful now. So that's effectively going from 160 horsepower to 500. So this is, even above Formula E levels of performance in terms of a motor. It will still be tiny. It will be like the sort of a large roll of kitchen roll that you would have in your kitchen to wipe your hands, or maybe that blue stuff you use in the workshop. So it will still be a tiny motor, but now it has to be attached to the front of the engine. Currently it sits at the side of the engine so that it's housed within the survival cell, so that potentially if there's an accident, you don't have a big lump of electrical equipment, flying around as debris, which again is very sensible. And the weight for that has increased slightly. The whole hybrid package will be 50 kilograms. So 50 kilograms, 500 horsepower. Yeah. I wish my road car had that level of power to weight performance from its engine. I'd probably be lucky if I got 50 horsepower. So yeah, so we will still have that, and you will only recover energy now under braking, which is, as we were discussing earlier, is going to be the big limitation. Some circuits where you don't have a lot of braking, I think Silverstone is always one of the classic examples, quite restrictive in terms of regenerative braking. The teams are going to be struggling to work out how to get enough energy back into the battery in order to have the car running along the straights. Now, you can actually, under the new rules, actually charge the battery on the straights. So when you're at wide open throttle, you could actually engage the MGU-K slightly to actually start to charge. And lots of road cars have this. I drove a Porsche Panamera. I know the BMW have the technology as well, that you can, quite efficiently slowly charge the battery in a straight line, just to give you that availability of energy when you come to the next acceleration zone.
I'm assuming 8-speed gearbox is still an active diffs?
Gearbox is already super light anyway, but there is a minimum weight now, so teams can't, take loads of weight out the gearbox like they used to in the 2000s. The gearbox is also limited in its length as well. So the 7-speed gearbox, but with the availability of the electric torque from the MGU-K and the experience we've had of having these hybrid cars with 8-speed gearboxes, you don't really need that 8th gear. It's quite easy for the teams now to be able to predict their gear ratios and not suffer like you would have had in the old days, where the work of Friday and Saturday in the DFE days is all about finding that perfect gear ratio to make the most of it. It's with that, there hasn't been a debate for over a decade.
Even though they can't change ratios more than once a year, I think now it's only in mid-season. I think, yeah.
The Joker has been removed from the regulations mostly for most of the years that we've run these 8-speed gearboxes and fixed ratios. It's just not an issue. Differentials will remain exactly the same. They're not technically active, but we know that the differential is one of the key tuning devices for the car's handling to get it to rotate into corners. And you see the drivers playing with the buttons on the steering wheel and, diff settings flashing up on the dash all the time. That will remain as it is. There's no real change in that respect.
My one, well, not one, but at the moment, my one regret is that they haven't gone to active ride. I think that would have been so appropriate given the cars of today and the way automotive technology is going and the way Formula One would now have handled active ride, particularly if the whole key to it is going to be running as low as possible again. Well, it always is, isn't it? Then it would have been so nice to have seen that. But obviously I guess they just thought it was too expensive, too complicated as ever, or not invented.
I don't know. I think it's a case of, let's decide where we want to push, the development and the team's budgets. I agree. Active ride really should come back to Formula One. And we're still kind of stuck in that hangover, post 94 with all the active devices being banned. And the other one of that is, funny enough, is actually the steering. The steering rack still has to be, although it's hydraulically assisted, it still has to have a mechanical power assistance valve on it. It can't have an electronic one. And as we've proven with the, with what you would describe as the active diff, with the electronic diff, with regulations and the standard ECU in sensors, you can have electronic devices now that you can monitor and prevent teams doing things that you don't want them to, which was part of the reason both of those were banned. In terms of it being the cost that the teams used to put into their previous passive mechanical suspensions pre-2022 was enormous. And I know we've discussed this in the past. The collapsible heave springs would be completely redesigned every year, needed to be reset up for every circuit with different springs and different gas pressures. That all got banned along with the inertia for 2022. And teams, as we know, have developed and spent a huge amount of money trying to get the suspension, which is now a very simple passive mechanical suspension, to do what they want it to do, to prevent poor ride, to prevent porpoising and bouncing. So having active would probably end up being overall a cost saving, because as much as there is an initial investment in the development of getting it up and running, because of, there's very few people probably left in the teams that were around in the early 90s when active suspension was all new, and technology itself has moved on, and vehicle dynamics, understand, has moved on massively since then. But in terms of the equipment, you've already got the hydraulic control system on the car. It wouldn't be difficult to make that able to support active ride. Where the expense would be the actual actuators that act as the springs and the dampers. So who went out and found a spec supplier for them, which could even be one of the teams. Red Bull, McLaren, lots of the teams provide parts to every other team as part of the ongoing regulations. So having a standard actuator, we can actually go to active ride quite cheaply and effectively, and your overall R&D cost of having to develop that car year on year and from circuit to circuit would suddenly become so much easier. And it wouldn't become like it was in the 90s, some kind of driver raid or some kind of magic carpet ride, because, as I say, we have the ability to monitor it and say, this is all you can do with the suspension, rather than messing around with the detail engineer of mechanical parts. You just flick a dial or change a piece of code.
Absolutely. And if they're going to make it that easy to overtake, and they're constantly doing that, why not make it easy for the car to ride over the curbs and the bumps as well? I mean, it's why not? There's no logic in separating the two, really.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, but again, I think it was just a case of let's focus on certain facets, and maybe that will come in the future. I know whenever I've spoken to any engineer in the sport, they've always wanted it to come back, but there's never been that groundswell of opinion to kind of just push it over the line at the end.
Self-starter?
Self-starter is standard now. You very rarely see a car being started with the external starter being pushed in to the back of the diffuser. Mercedes were the last engine manufacturer, power unit manufacturer, to make their car self-starting. And even in the garage now, where it would be quite easy for you to insert the starter, they start on the MGU K. Now, that was a 180 horsepower starter motor. They've now got a 500 horsepower starter motor. So even with a super hot engine, stalled on the straight, after a big spin, that engine will spin over, probably even if it had seized, with the power of the MGU-K acting as a starter motor now. And I think that was just one of those really clever things. We won't have pit lane electric, which I think is a bit of a shame because of the way that the architecture of the engine has worked. And I can't see that ever coming in under the current power or the upcoming power unit regulations. Maybe it's something they might want to consider for the future. IndyCar are going to be going that way with their new hybrid package, but with it being a series setup, it won't happen, which I think is a shame. It would be something pretty cool to see.
And finally, Scarbs, I'm assuming it's McLaren Applied doing all the ECU and all the electronics, correct?
So there will be a new ECU. There's a new specification for 2026. And this same ECU will look after both the power unit and all the chassis functions. Currently, it's McLaren Applied, who have been providing it since, wow, what was it, going back now, 2006? I guess that they'll probably have the tender for this. I don't know if it's been published anywhere, but yeah, that would be a good guess. And I know that they've been developing an ECU ready for this, and all of the other bits that go around it, because you know the ECU is one part, but then you have lots of interfaces to the engine, interfaces into the chassis, plus all of the parts that come from all these other different manufacturers, and some of them being McLaren applied as well. So yeah, there is a real suite of electronics on these cars from all sorts of sources. Some that seems are free to buy themselves, some that are specified by the FIA, and you have to buy from certain manufacturers, such as McLaren applied, such as BF1 for the tire temperature pressure sensors in the wheels. So that will be another step forwards, and the teams will have to decide how they package this within the confines of what will be a much smaller car.
Brilliant. Well, send over some sketches of what you think it's all going to look like.
Yes, I've got to get to the drawing board. That's the next step.
Brilliant. Look forward to those. Thanks so much, Scarbs, again, for your time and your input.
Thanks, Peter.